Evolutionary religion is a field of study that seeks to understand the origins and development of religious beliefs and practices from an evolutionary perspective, whether biological, psychological, or social. It is not a religion per se, but an analytical lens for understanding the religious phenomenon. The core of the concept evolutionary religions lies in the idea that religion, like other human characteristics, may have emerged and developed throughout the evolution of our species. There are two main schools of thought regarding how this might have happened. The first, selective advantage, a view that suggests that religion evolved through natural selection, conferring an adaptive advantage on the human groups that possessed it. This advantage could include cooperation, altruism, and trust within groups, thus facilitating hunting, defense, and collective survival. Moral norms and social sanctions institutionalized by religion would have reinforced these behaviors. Religion and its meanings, its gods and tribal principles, have offered answers to existential questions since primitive times. With their polytheistic worship, spirit worship, symbolic fetishes, and symbols themselves, they have provided answer to death and suffering, providing solace and meaning to life, which may have contributed to the psychological resilience of individuals and groups. Belief in a supernatural entity that observes and judges human behavior could have encouraged conformity to social rules, reducing internal conflicts. Another perspective argues that religion is a mere byproduct of the mental adaptations that were developed for different reasons. For example, the human ability to recognize patterns, where none exist, to infer intentionality in events, agency, and to develop theories of mind, the ability to understand the mental states of others, that is, psychology as we know it, many have naturally led to belief in gods or spirits. These capabilities, although useful for survival in other contexts, would have generated a religious side effect. It's important to note that evolutionary religion doesn't necessarily deny the existence of a deity. Speaking of which, this video is based on the Urantian Book and compared to Xavier Picasso's The Christian God. Watch the video until the end. I am sure you'll enjoy it. It's important to note that evolutionary religion doesn't deny the existence of a god or a transcendent purpose. Many evolutionists, theists for example, seek to reconcile the theory of biological evolution with the idea of a deity, seeing evolution as God's method of creation. The evolution of consciousness and its relationship to religion, historically. Is consciousness simple? Is it something emergent? Or is it something pre-existing? The evolution of human consciousness fundamental to understanding the emergence and complexity of religion. As the human brain grew and became more sophisticated, cognitive abilities emerged that paved the way for religious thought. The increase in brain size, it allowed for greater capacity for reflection, symbolism, and abstraction. The development of language was essential for the transmission of myths, rituals, and complex beliefs between generations and with groups. The ability to establish social norms, empathy, and altruism, essential coexistence in complex societies, is intrinsically linked to the evolution of consciousness and cohesion. The eradication of barbarism, which religion supplied with more fraternal responses, in an evolutionary society was explicitly an evolution of the moral and ethical concepts that religion brought us, through the intricate system of evolution, of the perception of divinity within us. This required a gigantic effort of self-knowledge and the discarding of deeply held superstitions beliefs, which unfortunately still prevail in many social regions and among nations. The awareness of our own finitude led us to search for explanation and promises of our afterlife, which is a central theme of many religions. The oldest archaeological evidence of religious ritualistic behavior dates back to the Middle Paleolithic 45,000 to 200,000 years ago, and is based primarily on the treatment of funeral rituals. Historically, religion evolved from animistic and polytheistic forms in archaic societies, where nature and phenomena were attributed to spirits and a particular deity. Over time, with the development of more complex societies and increased cognitive capabilities, beliefs became more elaborate, led into the emergence of pantheons of gods, and eventually to monotheism in some cultures. The formation of theology and philosophy. Theology and philosophy, although distinct, have interconnected origins in the evolution of human consciousness and the search to understand reality and the human being's place within it. From mythical consciousness to philosophical consciousness. In the early days of humanity, the understanding of the world was predominantly mythical, based on narrative that explained natural phenomena, the origin of the universe, and the role of the gods. This mythical consciousness was the basis of archaic religiosity. The emergence of philosophy. In ancient Greece, philosophy emerged as a new way of explaining reality, gradually abandoning mythical explanations in favor of logical rational concepts. The first philosophers, the pre-Socratics, sought universal principles for the formation of the world, physics, searching for an primordial element that would explain everything. With Socrates, philosophy turned to the human being anthropological period, investigating morality, knowledge, and the soul. Philosophy represents a transition from belief to meaning, to what can be explained by human reason. The formation of theology as a systematic study of God and revealed truths, developed later, often in dialogue, and sometimes in tension, with philosophy. In the Christian context, for example, theology sought to articulate understanding of the person of Christ and the meaning of salvation history. The early church fathers produced theology based on spiritual experience, with the aim of instructing and guiding their communities. In the Middle Ages, theology became more organized and intellectual, especially under the influence of Aristotle, who provided a logical corpus to define theology. As a discourse, like Thomas Aquinas, theology is a discourse on the formation of the world, physics, seeking an primal element that explained everything. With Socrates, philosophy turned to the human being, anthropological period, investigating morality, the body, and the soul. Philosophy represents a transition from belief to meaning, to be explained by reason. The formation of theology, with a philosophy of God and revealed truths, developed backward, often in dialogue and sometimes in tension with philosophy. In the Christian context, for example, theology seeks to articulate understanding of the role of Christ and the meaning of the salvation history. The early church fathers developed theology from a spiritual perspective, aiming to connect and unite their communities. In the Middle Ages, theology became more organized and intellectual, especially with the influence of Aristotle, who provided a logical corpus to define theology as a rigorous discourse. Medieval scholasticism, with thinkers like Thomas Aquinas, conceived consciousness as a faculty of intellect and theology as a study of divine goodness, human freedom, and the origin of evil based on revelation. The Trinity action in historical orders, or in other words, historical theological development. The first age, patristics, Trinitarian theology arose from the believer's experience of the drama of salvation, the presence and action of God in Christ and the Spirit. The Church Fathers sought to express this experience coherently, but without excessive concern for the logical definition of the Trinity. Theology was more spiritual and institutional. In the Middle Ages, scholasticism, theology became more intellectual and systematic. Under the influence of Aristotle, a rigorous discourse on the Trinity was sought. In St. Augustine, we see an approach where the Trinity is mentioned, with an emphasis on the analogy of the human mind, that is, mind, knowledge, and love as a reflection of the divine Trinity. He seeks the oneness of essence with the plurality of person. In the development of later scholasticism, the question of the Trinity was resolved through formal logic, seeking to explain the coexistence of their person in one divine essence. The complexity of the debate highlights the difficulty in reconciling faith and reason. Saint Bonaventure, also known as Giovanni Findanza, 1217, had a strong influence on the philosophy and theology of St. Augustine, with an emphasis on mysticism and the search for God through faith and reason. Thomas Aquinas sought to synthesize revelation and reason, albeit with distinct approaches. Bonaventure, more mystical, saw theology as a loving science and a vision of God as knowledge that leads to love. Thomas Aquinas, more rational, sought to define theology as a science-based revelation, but using logical instruments. The great Christian mystery and the reluctance to reason, due to the difficulty of harmonizing reason and revelation, according to theologian Xavier Picazza, who reiterates the central problem of how to reconcile the truth of the Trinity with reason, affirm that theology has historically oscillated between the search for rational discourse and the acceptance of the Trinity as a great mystery that transcendent reason. His critique of the reducting of the mystery and implicit in those who preferred to simply label it a mystery rather than strive to reason about it. He argued that theology should not defend its inability to understand the Trinity, but rather attempt to reason about it, even if this requires expanding the horizons of reason. Therefore, in religious evolutionism, the understanding of the Trinity is linked to progress in the life of the Church and religious experience. This connects directly with the idea of evolutionary religion, where theological understanding is not static, but develops over time, influenced by experience and the human search for meaning. Therefore, theology must remain open to new ways of understanding of God or the history of religious consciousness, that is, the way the Trinity has been understood over the centuries. From the initial experience of patristics, through the systematization of scholasticism, to the most modern approaches, humanity has conscientiously sought to express and understand divinity in more sophisticated ways. This is, in essence, a history of the evolution of religious consciousness about the Trinity. The human mind struggles to make sense of a complex reality. And speaking of complex reality, we have the Urantian Book, which presents a macro history of the evolution of the understanding of God, from polytheistic through henotheism, monotheism, and finally Trinitarianism. In this document, this is an experiential protest against a de-anthropomorphized and solitary God, reflecting an intrinsic need of human consciousness for a relational God. Both sources view the understanding of divinity as a dynamic, not static, process. Cognitive adaptation, that is, the tension between revelation and reason, the clash between theology and philosophy, and the search for a Trinitarian logic, demonstrate the human mind's struggle to integrate divine revelation, which at first glance seems contradictory with the tools of reason. The human capacity to deal with paradoxes and seek unified explanations, even if paraconsistent, is an aspect of cognitive evolution. The debate over whether to accept mystery or reason about it reflects different adaptive strategies for dealing with the unknown and the transcendent. The Urantian Book implicitly highlights the complexity of the Trinity, in the case our Christian Trinity. The fact that they are their paradise datas with unique and original functions, which are not a simple sum, requires a mind capable of going beyond the obvious. Criticism of philosophy that abstracts from God's personal qualities suggests that certain rational approaches are ill-adapted for a full understanding of deity, given its essential complexity. Critique of scholasticism and intellectual theology. Friar Peter Damian, in 1072, criticizes the principle of neo-contradiction and the coincidence of apposites by Nicholas of Susa 1464. Both challenged the rational orthodoxy of the time, suggesting that God transcends human logical categories. Damian asserted that God's omnipotence could go beyond logic, for example, causing what has already been done not to have done. Susa spoke of learned ignorance and the coincidentia oppositorum, the coincidence of opposites in God, where opposing perfections meet and resolve themselves. Take this induction in rational logic, for example. God is a visible and contradictory being who possesses a high degree of being both one and three. This statement alone summarized the complexity. God is not simply a mysterious or paradoxical being, but rather a being who, in his fullness, embodies and transcends what we consider contradiction, which, in fact, reveals a higher reality. Despite the different approaches philosophy, Western theology, and the Urantian Book, with its own terminology and alien cosmology, there is a profound correlation and, arguably, an attempt to demonstrate the same theorem about the Trinity and the nature of God. The central theorem, deity transcends human logic and is intrinsically relational and paradoxically unified. Theology and philosophy explicitly state that traditional rationality, classical Aristotelian and Kantian, is insufficient for deity. God is too contradictory for human logic. The solution is a paraconsistent rationality, which accepts apparent contradictions as part of divine reality. The Urantian Book, although it doesn't use the term paraconsistent. By the way, here on my channel has a short playlist about philosophy in Latin America, where I superficially address paraconsistent logic. The idea that impossibility of conceiving the uniqueness of a de-anthropomorphized, solo deity of significance unrelated to the universe points to the same gap. The human mind, even in its evolution, cannot conceive of a God who fits neatly into unilateral categories of unity or abstraction. The Trinity, with its three unified steps, is already, in itself, a concept that challenges the linear logic of simple oneness. Evolving religion, the Christian triune revelation, implicitly emphasizes the essential ity of relationality and personality in the Godhead. The idea of God as simultaneously one and triune, the Trinity, is how divine plenitude is expressed in internal relationship. The coincidence of opposites in God suggests an internal dynamic that is not static. The Urantian Book is extremely explicit personality in deity. Deity needs relationship to be fully realized in its personality. The Trinity is not addition, but a condition for the expression of divine personality. The protest against a solitary, de-anthropomorphized God resonates with the need for a relational God. The proposal of a paraconsistent logic to understand God suggests that this deeper understanding of divinity will bring a new perspective on reality itself. The ability to accept God's complexity is reflected in the acceptance of the world's complexity. The Urantian Book states, through the recognition of the Trinity concept, the human mind can hope to grasp something of the interrelationship of love and law in the creations of time and space. The triune structures of God is the foundation for the order and dynamics of the universe. Spiritual faith, which brings clarity to God's love, connects inner experience with the cosmic order. Criticism of the philosophical reduction of God, for abstracting from God's personal qualities, as previously stated, for not encompassing divine plenitude with its traditional logic, for abstracting from personal qualities in the concept of deity of pure monotheism, thus reducing the idea to an unrelated God to the status of a pantheistic absolute. What have I demonstrated so far? Part of the video delves deeper into a summary, with the psychology of the video inserted between the lines, suggesting some interpretation based on monotheistic logic. Those familiar with theology will understand the statements I'm presenting. And if you've reached this part of the video, thank you very much for watching. While the unity of the Trinity and the plurality of the Godhead, review and deepening evolutionary monotheism reaffirms that it arose from a philosophical protest against the inconsistency of polytheism, passing through pantheons, monotheist, and finally the exclusion of all except the one God. This reinforced the perspective of an evolution of human consciousness. Trinitarianism is based on the experiential protest against a solitary, de-anthropomorphized, and unrelated God. The personality of deity requires that such deity exist in relation to another, equal, and personal deity. Therefore, this idea implies a theorem of cosmology, thus, the paradise. Trinity is a universal of the Seidor sons and the creative daughters. The Trinity is a real enity, not a singular personality, but compatible with the coexisting personalities of Father, Son, and Infinite or Holy Spirit. Its functions are unique, original, and not entirely predicatable from an analysis of individual attributes. For example, justice is a group function. Therefore, there is an insertion of a new metaphysics, with the introduction of deeper and more complex cosmological concepts about the structure of reality and deity, or what? Deity and the triunity based on monotheism. It is understood that there is the existence of the I Am as the primordial force, the unqualified infinity as unity, the foundation of all reality and eternity. Therefore, the internal interrelations of the Trinity, self-segmented into 7 phases of infinity, or primary self-relations, therefore simultaneously with the self-segmentation of the I Am, suggests 7 absolutes of infinity. These are eternal entities that seem to be co-foundations of the reality associated with the phases of the I Am affirmation. Well, this is an affirmation which can be intuited, because the I Am affirmation is something purely monistic. It is pure monotheism understood by both philosophy and secular theology. So, then, do we have the internal primordial relationship, that is, the relations of a unity internal I Am, as their fold self-differentiations, and something to think about then. Remember, we are talking about metaphysics, Cartesian, is in its sextuple and sevenfold form, and the seven absolutes of infinity duality eternalizes the foundations of duality. They eternalize the potential of all reality, encompassing both deified and non-deified reality. The triunities factualize the understanding of infinity as a universal function. Despite the highly specific and cosmological language of the Urantian Book, it is possible to find correlations with theology, especially in the central door identified previously. Theology affirms that deity, or God, transcends simple human logic and is intrinsically relational, personally paradoxically unified, being the basis for intelligibility and evolution of reality, including human consciousness. Therefore, deity, or God, as a complex and relational unity, defies simple logic. The I Am is unqualified infinity while being unity. But at the same time, it undergoes self-differentiations, their fold and sixfold, which are its relations of unity. Furthermore, the Paradise Trinity is a real entity, a supersummation, whose functions are unique, original, and not entirely predicatable from the sum of its parts. The deity is complex and operates in ways that transcend linear logic. The idea that the deity demands that such deity exist in relation to another equal and personal deity is the core of this intrinsic relationally. Therefore, as previously stated, the insertion of a paraconsistent logic is necessary to analyze the complex or seemingly contradictory identity, to understand that God is something visible possessing a high degree of being both one and triune. Theology insists that the relationship between the divine persons is fundamental. Both alien metaphysics and Cosmological theology rely on the idea that the Godhead, especially in the form of the Trinity, cannot be understood by simple logic. Thus we have the central theorem, the evolution of consciousness and evolutionary religion. Religion is not static, but dynamic and evolutionary. Xavier Picasso, in his History of Trinitarian Theology, which he described in his book, The Christian God, bears witness to this. From experiential and less systematized understanding of patristic, through the intellectualization of scholasticism, to approaches that seek a paraconsistent rationals for the Trinity, the way humanity conceives of God, and in particular the Trinity, is not fixed. It is a continuous process of progress and the search for new forms of understanding. The very struggle to integrate logic with revelation is a driving force behind this evolution. The Urantian Book presents a cosmic and terrestrial narrative of progressive revelation. Monotheism evolves from polytheism, and Trinitarism emerges as a response to a deeper experiential need. The Urantis revelation positions itself as an advanced stage of this evolution, providing an understanding of deity and the universe that is intended to be more complete and comprehensive, especially for expanding cosmic horizons. Deity itself engages in an evolving universe. In both perspectives, the capacity of human consciousness to reflect, symbolize, create language, develop morally, and seek meaning is what makes religion possible and drives its evolution. As consciousness becomes more sophisticated, whether through biological, cultural, or spiritual evolution, the capacity to grasp new, more complex divine concepts also increases. The impossibility of conceiving a solitary God, as described in the Urantian Book, and the search for a logic that accepts contradictions, as described in the Christian God, are reflections of the needs and longings of human consciousness at different stages of its development. Human experience, love, relationship, suffering, and death drives the search for a God who resonates with this experience, leading to more relational and complex concepts like the Trinity. Therefore, we have the Trinity as the convergence point of this evolution, the supersummation and the complex identity. The Trinity in both narratives, the supersummation of the paradise deities in the Urantian and the complex identity of theology that demands a paraconsistent logic, represents an evolutionary leap in the understanding of divinity. Not a simple single or multiple God, but a reality that transcends the binary categories. Therefore, for a general understanding of this exposition in this video, I conclude with central topic: the relational God. The recognition that personality in the Godhead requires that such deity exist in an equal and personal relationship, and the centrality of the relationship between the divine persons are fundamental. A God who is intrinsically relational, the Trinity, is better able to connect with a human consciousness that is, by nature, relational and social. This is not just a theological issue, but a profound resonance with the structure of human consciousness and society itself. Therefore, in conclusion, if religion evolves with consciousness, then the forms of understanding and for a continuous expansion of cosmic horizons. This is what the insertion of an alien conceptualization like that of the Urantian Book suggests, the existence of even more advanced perspective on deity and the cosmos. Theology, with its new approach paraconsistent logic, demonstrates that it is not a static discipline that merely reps dogmas, but a field of continuous and dynamic inquiry that adapts and deepens as human consciousness evolves and acquires new capabilities and experience. Therefore, the central theorem is this inseparable interaction between the evolution of human and cosmic conciseness and the evolution of the understanding of divinity, culminating in the complexity and relationality of the Trinity. Well, folks, is the Trinity, the Holy Trinity, the definitive personality of God? What do you think? Feel free to comment. And thank you very much for watching the video.